There is a discrepancy buried inside the Melungeon genome that took researchers years to state plainly. The fathers and the mothers do not come from the same world. Trace the male line, the Y chromosome, handed down son to son. And it runs back again and again to Africa. Trace the female line, the mitochondrial DNA that only a mother passes to her children. And it runs back just as consistently to Europe. Two origins braided into a single people, and the seam where they meet holds a history the families themselves were never told, and that the country they were born into spent 3 centuries working to forget. The men have been argued about for decades. This is about the women, and what the genetic record says about them is quieter and harder than anything the folklore prepared anyone to hear. For generations, the Melungeon question was asked about the community as a whole. Who were these dark-complexioned families clustered along Newman's Ridge and the Vardy Valley of Hancock County, Tennessee, with their recurring surnames Collins, Gibson, Goins, Mullins, Bunch, and their insistence that they had been in the mountains before the first documented settlers arrived? The answer historians settled on was the triracial isolate, a frontier people formed from European, African and native ancestry, mixed at the margins of a hardening society and withdrawn into the hills. It was a reasonable answer. It was told in good faith, and it treated the Melungeons the way a blend is treated. As an average and undifferentiated mixture, 3 streams poured into 1 cup. But an average erases the thing that matters most. It tells you what a people are made of. It does not tell you who did the making, or under what conditions, or at what cost. And it does not tell you the one fact that changes the entire meaning of the story, that the mixing was not symmetrical. It had a direction, it had a shape. And when you read the maternal line on its own, separated from the paternal line it had always been averaged against, the shape that emerges is not a blend at all. It is a testimony. It was also, for a long time, unspeakable. Here is what the maternal data actually shows. When geneticists isolated the mitochondrial lineages of the core Melungeon families, the DNA that passes only through mothers, mother to daughter, unbroken and unmixed across the centuries, the haplogroups that came back were, in the main, European. The ordinary matrilineal signatures of the British Isles and Northern Europe. Not African, in most of the founding lines, not Native American, European, which means that the women at the root of the Melungeon family tree, the mothers of the first generation, the ones from whom these lineages descend, were overwhelmingly white women. And that single fact, set against the African paternal lines running alongside it, reconstructs a specific kind of union, not European men and African women, which was the common and legally tolerated pattern of the plantation world, the pattern of enslavers and the enslaved. The reverse, African men and European women. In colonial Virginia, in the decades when these lineages were founded, that was the one combination the law could not abide. It was the union the statutes were written to destroy. This is not mythology. This is genomics, and the genome was pointing directly at the women the law had tried hardest to erase. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what mitochondrial DNA is. Outside the nucleus of every human cell sits a second tiny genome, carried in the mitochondria, the structures that power the cell, and it is inherited in only one direction. A mother passes it to all of her children, but only her daughters pass it on again. It does not recombine, does not blend with the father's contribution, does not shuffle each generation the way the rest of the genome does. It is a nearly unbroken text, copied down the female line with only the slow drift of rare mutation to mark the centuries. That makes it the closest thing human biology offers to a maternal signature. A way to reach back past every name the records kept and read directly the deep ancestry of the women. And when that text was read in the Melungeon families, the letters that came back were the ordinary maternal haplogroups of Europe, H and T and U and K, the lineages of the British Isles and the North Sea coast, not the L lineages, of sub-Saharan Africa that dominated the fatherline, and not the A, B, C, and D lineages that would have marked native maternal descent. The mothers and the fathers had come from opposite shores of the Atlantic world. The genome had caught the colony in the one act it most wanted no one to see. 3 explanations rose to account for the maternal pattern. None of them, on its own, closes the question, and each one is more difficult to sit with than the last. The first is the free community explanation, and it is the gentlest. In the earliest decades of the Chesapeake colonies, before slavery had fully hardened into a permanent, heritable, color-defined institution, there existed a brief and now largely forgotten world in which the lines between people were more porous than they would ever be again. Africans and Europeans arrived into the same brutal system of indentured labor, worked the same fields, lived in the same quarters, ran away together and, inevitably, formed families together. Among them were free and freed African men and European women, some indentured, some poor, some simply outside the reach of the families that might have policed them. In this reading, the Melungeon founding mothers were partners in the fullest sense, women who chose, within the narrow room the world allowed them, to build households and bear children with the men they lived beside. The mitochondrial evidence in this light is a record of ordinary human attachment in an extraordinary and closing moment. Its strength is its humanity. It restores agency to the women. Its weakness is that it may restore more agency than the historical conditions can bear, because the world these women lived in was not, for most of them, a world of free choices. Historians of early Virginia have a name for the people of that first fluid era: the charter generation, the men and women, African and European, who arrived before the racial caste system had calcified, and who lived lives the 18th century would soon make legally impossible. Some Africans in that generation completed their terms of indenture and walked free, acquired land, held servants of their own, sued and were sued in open court, and appear in the records as men of standing. Anthony Johnson, brought to Virginia in bondage in the 1620s, ended his life a free landholder on the eastern shore. In a world where an African man could be free and propertied, his union with a European servant woman was not yet the unthinkable transgression it would later become. It was uncommon, and it was watched, but it happened, and it happened often enough to found lineages. The free community explanation rests on this: that the Melungeon mothers belonged to the last generation of American women for whom such a family was legally survivable, and that they built those families in the closing minutes before the door swung shut. What the explanation cannot fully carry is everyone who came after that door closed, the women whose unions formed not in the open air of the charter generation, but in the deepening shadow of a system that now existed to punish them for it. The second explanation is stranger, and it concerns the women who vanished, because not every maternal line in the Melungeon genome is European. Threaded through the mitochondrial record are lineages that are Native American and lineages that are African. mtDNA, signatures that mark the presence of indigenous women and of African women at the root of certain families, women who contributed their entire matrilineal inheritance to the community and then disappeared almost completely from its written history. This is the maternal ghost population, in a society where surnames followed fathers, where property and identity and the very right to a recorded name descended through the male line. The mothers who were not European left almost no documentary trace at all. No deed carries their name, no court record names them as anything but an incident. They survived the way a ghost population always survives. Not as a monument, not as a story, but as a mathematical certainty in the genome of their descendants. You can see the shape of them. You cannot see them. An indigenous woman whose people were being removed even as her grandchildren were being reclassified. An African woman whose status the law was busy making inheritable and permanent. They were here. They were real. And the record keeps almost nothing of them but the DNA. They passed down, glowing quietly in a lineage that forgot their faces. The timing of their erasure was its own cruelty. The indigenous women whose mitochondrial lines surface in a handful of Melungeon families contributed that inheritance in the very decades when the native nations of the southeast were being dispossessed and driven west, their presence in the record shrinking even as their genetic contribution was carried forward into families that would soon be forbidden to claim it. The African women, meanwhile, were being folded into a status the colony was busy making permanent and heritable, so that a maternal line which might once have been free was by law becoming its opposite. In both cases, the genome preserves a woman the archive was actively deleting in real time. This is what a ghost population is, in its most intimate form. Not a vanished ancient tribe, but a specific mother, 2 or 10 generations back, whose entire recorded existence has been reduced to a percentage and a haplogroup in the cells of people who never knew her name. She left no monument, she left a daughter. And through that daughter, a line of daughters, reaching all the way to a woman alive today who carries her mitochondria and has never been told whose they are. And then there is the third explanation, the one the researchers approached most carefully, and the one that gives this story its darkest register, because it concerns not who the women were, but what was done to them, and what cannot now be known. The maternal genome tells you the origin of a lineage. It does not tell you the circumstances of its founding. A European mtDNA line at the root of a Melungeon family proves that a white woman was there at the beginning and that her daughters and her daughters' daughters carried her forward. It does not tell you whether she was a wife or a servant, whether she stayed or was sold away from her own children, whether the union that began the line was one of attachment or of coercion under a system in which the people involved often had no power to refuse anything, in a world of indenture and bondage where women's bodies were governed by contracts and statutes and the will of masters. The line between choice and force is not one the genome can draw. And this is the disturbing thing the maternal record finally exposes. It encodes love and violence in exactly the same molecule. The mitochondrial DNA of a beloved wife and the mitochondrial DNA of a woman with no power to say no look precisely identical 5 generations later. The archive cannot separate them. No one is willing to say, in a published paper, how many of these founding unions were the one and how many were the other. Not because the question doesn't matter, because the evidence to answer it was deliberately never kept, and the silence was not accidental. A system that profited from the labor of bound women and bound children had no incentive to record whether those women had consented to anything and every incentive not to. Consent was legally irrelevant to a servant. The question simply did not arise in the documents because the law did not consider it a question. So the archive that might have told us how these families truly began was never generated in the first place. Not lost, not destroyed, but never made, because the men with the power to make it did not regard the inner lives of these women as facts worth keeping. For a long time, these 3 explanations circled one another, unresolved, and then the documentary record was laid down beside the genetic one, and what it revealed about the women was not ambiguous at all. It was the law itself. The most systematic genetic study of the Melungeon core families remains the work published in 2012 in the Journal of Genetic Genealogy by the research team led by Roberta Estes, alongside collaborators including Jack Goins, Penny Ferguson, and Janet Lewis Crane. The Melungeon DNA Project, which paired Y chromosome and mitochondrial results with a deep dive into the colonial paper trail. It was that study, more than any other, that established the asymmetry, African paternal lines, European maternal lines, and a documentary origin among the free people of color of 17th century Virginia. But it is when you set the mitochondrial finding against the statute books of the colony those women lived in that the word in this story's title stops being a provocation and becomes a description. Consider what Virginia did to these women in law. In the exact decades the Melungeon lineages were forming, In 1662, the colony enacted that a child's condition, bond or free, would follow that of the mother rather than the father, breaking with English precedent and ensuring that status became something a woman transmitted through her own body. In 1691, Virginia went further and went directly at the women the Melungeon genome descends from. The act declared that any free English or white woman who bore a child by a Negro or mulatto man would be fined heavily, and if she could not pay, and most could not, she would be sold into servitude for 5 years. And her child would be bound out as a servant until the age of 30 years of another person's labor, extracted as the price of that child's existence. The 1705 revisions extended and hardened the scheme. The genome says a white woman stood at the beginning of these families. The statute says that for standing there, the colony took her freedom and then took 3 decades of her child's. The documentary work of the genealogist Paul Heinegg, who spent years reconstructing the free families of colonial Virginia and the Carolinas from the surviving deeds, wills, tax lists, and court minutes, put names to the pattern the statutes describe. In record after record, the free families that would later be called Melungeon trace back to exactly this configuration: a European or European-descended woman, free or lately released from servitude, and the mixed ancestry children she bore, whose free status the whole family's future depended on. And the place these women most often appear in the archive is itself the tell. They surface in the bastardy presentments and the servitude bonds, the legal machinery of punishment. A woman enters the written record at the moment the county fines her, or extends her indenture, or binds out her child to a master. She is documented as a defendant. Her name survives because she was being sanctioned. The single most reliable way to find a Melungeon founding mother in the colonial record is to look for a woman being penalized for existing, which means the archive of these women is, very nearly, an archive of their punishment and nothing else, and the laws followed the families west. As these households migrated down the Carolina Piedmont and into the mountains, seeking the thin distance a frontier could put between them and the county clerks, the legal apparatus that governed women's bodies and children's freedom traveled with them, rewritten in each new jurisdiction. The women kept transmitting freedom down the maternal line. The statutes kept trying to intercept it. The Melungeon community exists in the narrow margin where generation after generation the women won that contest by the barest possible measure. A margin counted in successful escapes from documentation, in children who reached adulthood still free, in mitochondrial lines that made it to the next daughter before the record could close around them. Estes, reflecting on what the years of testing revealed, was in the end less guarded than the peer-reviewed language allowed. What the project had uncovered, she suggested, was that the Melungeons were not the descendants of some faraway lost people at all, but among the very first free families of mixed African and European ancestry in the American colonies, which means the founding mothers were not a footnote to that beginning. They were the load-bearing wall of it. Every free child of color in those lineages was free because a specific woman had been free and had passed that freedom down through her body under a legal regime engineered to punish her for doing exactly that. The women were not incidental to the Melungeon story. They were the mechanism of its survival, and they paid for it in the only currency the colony recognized: their liberty and their children's. Now imagine it is a morning near the end of the 17th century, and you are one of them. You are a young woman in Tidewater, Virginia, and you have crossed an ocean under a contract that owns the next several years of your life. You work in a world where the walls between people have not yet fully gone up, where the African man beside you in the field is, like you, someone's property for a term of years, and where the two of you are closer in the eyes of the men who own your time than either of you is to them. A family forms, perhaps freely, perhaps not. The record will never say, and the record was never meant to. You bear a child, and the colony has a law waiting for exactly this child. You will be fined a sum you have never held in your hand. You will be sold, and the years you thought were yours will belong to someone else. And the infant at your breast has already been sentenced by a statute written before he was conceived to 30 years of service to a household not his own. You cannot read the law. You will never see the study written about your descendants 300 years from now, in a language of haplogroups and maternal lineages that does not yet exist. But you carry the entire thing forward inside you, the mitochondrial signature that will still be legible in your great-great-granddaughters on a ridge in Tennessee, the freedom you are being punished for transmitting, the whole suppressed architecture of a country's earliest and most fluid decades, folded into the body of a woman being sold for the crime of having loved or been forced across a line the colony was in the act of drawing. You are not a scandal, you are a founder, and the law that is taking everything from you this morning is, without knowing it, writing the first chapter of a people. Now move forward 6 generations to another morning, this one on Newman's Ridge in the middle of the 19th century. You are her descendant. You do not know her name, no one does, but you carry her mitochondria in every cell. And you carry too the story the family tells in place of her story, that you are Portuguese, that your people came from across the water, that your difference has a distant and respectable source. You say it because it is safer than the truth, and because the truth was taken from you on purpose, sold and bound and struck from the record until only the shield remained. You will pass the mitochondria to your daughters. You will pass the shield to them too, and neither of you will ever know that the deepest thing you carry is not a Portuguese sailor, but a punished woman in a Virginia courtroom, a century and a half gone, whose freedom is the only reason you are standing free on this ridge at all. Zoom out far enough, and the disturbing thing is not the women. It is what was built on top of them, and the care with which they were removed from the story afterward. The maternal genome is disturbing only against the background of an erasure so total we mistake it for silence. These women were the point of transmission, of freedom, of complexion, of the very possibility of a free community of color existing on the American frontier at all. And the society they lived in responded by writing them out of the record with one hand while punishing them with the other. Surnames followed the fathers, so the mothers left no name. Property followed the men, so the mothers left no deed. The law recognized these women mainly at the moment it sentenced them, and so their entire inheritance survives in the one place the colony could not legislate, the mitochondrial DNA passing quietly, unbroken, mother to daughter, down 300 years of women who were never told what they were carrying or what it had cost the first of them to carry it. It is not a diminishment of the Melungeons to say their line was founded by punished women. It is an expansion of it. It means the community's survival was not luck and not folklore, but the sustained generational endurance of women who transmitted freedom through their own bodies against a legal machine designed to make that impossible. The mitochondrial line is not a record of shame. It is a record of resistance so quiet it looks, at first, like nothing at all. A strand of molecules doing the one thing no statute could stop it from doing. There is a word for a manuscript that has been scraped clean and written over, where the older text bleeds faintly through the newer one and can, with the right light, still be read. A palimpsest. The Melungeon maternal genome is a palimpsest of exactly this kind. Over the buried, erased text of the founding mothers, the community wrote a second story, the Portuguese story, the Shield, and over that the nation wrote a third, the tidy, tri-racial footnote of the textbooks. 3 layers, each written to cover the one beneath it, and the deepest layer, the one the other 2 were built to hide, is not a legend or an ethnic label at all. It is a woman, a specific, unnamed punished woman whose only surviving words are the 4 letters of a haplogroup, and whose freedom the entire structure above her was erected in part to deny she ever had. Read her back into the light, and the whole palimpsest reorganizes around her. She was here, she was real, and the country that sold her is descended, in more ways than it has ever admitted, from women exactly like her. The Melungeon women were never what we thought they were. They were not a footnote to a male genetic mystery, and not a passive ingredient in a tri-racial blend, and not the exotic maidens of the Portuguese romance. They were the free and the bound women of colonial Virginia, the mothers whose names the record threw away, and whose freedom the law tried to confiscate. And they are the reason there was anyone left to test 3 centuries later at all. A mystery deepened, not solved, because the genome tells you that these women stood at the beginning and refuses to tell you what standing there was like for each of them, whether it was chosen or forced, endured or embraced. And that refusal is not a gap in the science, it is the shape of what was done. The evidence to answer the hardest question was deliberately, systematically never kept, and the not keeping is itself the most disturbing finding of all. The Melungeon women were never what we thought they were, and neither, it turns out, were any of us.